A man walks into a bank in a small town in the Midwest, and the loan officer barely looks up from her desk. He's wearing work boots caked in dried mud, jeans that have clearly seen a few decades of use, and a flannel shirt with a small tear near the collar. He asks about opening a new investment account, something substantial, and the loan officer, without meaning to be rude, assumes he's here about a loan, not an investment. She pulls up a form for a personal loan application and slides it across the desk. He gently slides it back and tells her, quietly, without a hint of pride in his voice, that he's not here to borrow money. He's here to deposit it. $240,000, cash, from selling part of his farmland. The loan officer's expression changes in real time, and if you'd been sitting in that lobby, you would have watched a woman completely recalibrate everything she thought she understood about this man in the span of about 4 seconds. This actually happened, more or less exactly like this, dozens of times, in dozens of towns, during a research project that would eventually rewrite the way an entire country thinks about money. And here's what makes it so unsettling, if you really sit with it. If that farmer had walked into that same bank wearing a suit, driving a car that cost more than his tractor, the loan officer might have believed him instantly. She might have nodded along, offered him coffee, treated him like the kind of person who obviously has money. Instead, because he looked like exactly what he was, a man who spent his life working with his hands and never cared much about appearances, she almost turned him away without a second thought. This is the strange, uncomfortable, and honestly kind of thrilling puzzle we're about to spend the next while unpacking together. Because the truth is, almost everything you believe about what wealthy people look like is wrong. Not slightly wrong, and by the time we get to the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why the people who look rich are so often barely holding on, why the people who look completely unremarkable are frequently sitting on fortunes, and why one single decision, made with the absolute best intentions, quietly wrecks more family fortunes than bad luck, bad markets, or bad jobs combined. That last one is going to sting a little. I promise you, it's worth the discomfort. Let's rewind to where this entire story actually begins, because it starts with a mistake. And honestly, mistakes are always where the good stories hide. In the early 1980s, a marketing professor named Thomas Stanley was hired to help a bank figure out how to sell more services to wealthy clients. Simple enough job, on paper. Find the rich people, understand what they want, help the bank sell to them. Except when Stanley actually went looking for these wealthy clients using the bank's own data, something strange kept happening. The people the bank assumed were wealthy, the ones with impressive titles, expensive cars parked outside their offices, corner suites with their names etched onto the door, kept turning out to have surprisingly thin bank balances. Once you actually looked past the surface and the people, nobody had flagged as wealthy at all. Quiet account holders with unremarkable jobs and unremarkable homes kept turning out to be sitting on enormous, almost absurd amounts of money. Stanley figured this had to be some kind of data error at first. Maybe the bank's records were outdated. Maybe there'd been some mix-up between account numbers. But the pattern didn't go away. It got stronger the more he looked. So he did something most marketing professors never bother doing. Instead of trusting the assumptions everyone around him had already made, he decided to go find out the truth for himself, directly, from actual wealthy people, in their own words. He teamed up with a researcher named William Danko, and together they built one of the largest, most detailed surveys of American millionaires ever attempted, asking questions nobody had really asked before. Not just how much do you earn, but how much do you spend. Say, what do you drive? What did you pay for your last suit, your last watch, your last vacation? Where did you grow up? And how did that shape the way you handle money now? And slowly, methodically, a pattern started to emerge that neither of them expected. One so consistent, it started to feel less like a coincidence and more like a hidden law of human behavior nobody had bothered to write down before. Before we get into what that pattern actually was, I want you to picture something with me for a second, because this is going to matter later, more than you might expect right now. Picture two neighbors living on the exact same street in houses that look almost identical from the outside. Same size, same price range, same neighborhood, same schools down the road. One of them drives a car that's nearly a decade old, still running fine, paid off years ago. The other drives something newer, sleeker, financed on a 5-year loan. If you had to guess, right now, which one of these two neighbors has more money sitting quietly in their accounts? Which one would you pick? Most people, if they're honest, would pick the one with the newer car. It just feels right, doesn't it? Newer car, nicer things, must mean more money. Except according to the data Stanley and Danko collected, that instinct is wrong far more often than it's right. And understanding exactly why is going to change how you look at almost everyone you know. Here's the first big idea, the one that cracks the whole illusion wide open. There are two completely different kinds of wealthy people in this world, and they almost never look the same. The first kind, researchers came to call the balance sheet affluent. These are people whose net worth, meaning what they actually own, minus what they actually owe, is genuinely high, often far higher than anyone around them would ever guess. Their wealth doesn't live on their bodies or in their driveways. It lives quietly in retirement accounts, in paid-off homes, in investment portfolios. Nobody outside their own household ever sees. The second kind, they called the income statement affluent. These are people whose paycheck looks impressive, sometimes extremely impressive, but whose actual net worth, once you subtract every loan and every balance, tells a completely different, much thinner story. Their wealth, if you can even call it wealth, is entirely visible, worn on their wrist, parked in their driveway, displayed in vacation photos, and underneath almost all of it, there's a stack of monthly payments keeping the entire performance afloat. Here's the sentence I want you to actually sit with, because it's the heartbeat of everything we're about to explore together. You cannot tell which one a person is just by looking at them, which means, statistically, some of the people you've quietly admired for their lifestyle over the years are probably drowning, and some of the people you've never given a second thought are probably sitting on more money than you could imagine. Let's put a real face on this, because numbers are easy to skim past, but stories are almost impossible to forget. There's a man in the original research given the name Mr. Frugal in the book because, well, it fit. He owned a manufacturing company, nothing glamorous, nothing that would ever end up in a magazine profile. By the time researchers sat down with him, he was worth several $1 million, quietly, without a hint of drama. And when they walked into his office to interview him, he was wearing a suit that looked like it had survived several changes in fashion trends, without anyone noticing or caring. They asked him directly, almost bluntly, why dress like this, when you could clearly afford absolutely anything you wanted? And his answer became one of the most quoted lines in the entire study. He said he never understood paying extra money for a name sewn onto a label when the plain version did exactly the same job for a fraction of the price. Every dollar he didn't spend trying to look successful, he said, stayed invested instead, quietly compounding, working for him while he slept, while he had dinner, while he lived a life that, on paper, looked almost embarrassingly ordinary. He wasn't cheap because he had no other option. He was disciplined because he understood something most people never stop long enough to consider, which is exactly what spending actually costs you, not just today, but for the next 20, 30, 40 years. That's the moment the whole illusion starts cracking, isn't it? We assume the people who look successful must be successful. But over and over again, in household after household, the data told a completely different story. Now, here's something Stanley discovered that genuinely stopped him in his tracks, something so simple it's almost embarrassing that nobody had measured it before. He built a formula, and I want you to actually run this on yourself as I explain it, because it's going to reveal something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Take your age, multiply it by your total household income before taxes. Divide that number by 10. Whatever comes out the other end is roughly what your net worth should be, if you're managing money the way genuinely wealthy households in this study did. Let's say someone is 45 years old, earning $90,000 a year. 45 times 90,000 comes out to $4,050,000. Divide that by 10, and their expected net worth sits right around $405,000. Here's where it gets uncomfortable, and I mean that in the most useful possible way. People whose actual net worth came in at double this number, or higher, Stanley called prodigious accumulators of wealth. People whose net worth sat at half this number, or lower, he called under-accumulators of wealth. Way, age, same income, wildly different outcomes, and the difference was almost never the paycheck. It was what happened to that paycheck after it landed. Let's meet a couple from the research, given the name, the Fitzgeralds, because their story is honestly kind of anticlimactic in the best possible way. Nothing extraordinary about their income at all. A husband working as a mid-level manager, a wife working part-time, combined earnings that placed them squarely, almost boringly, in the middle of the national income range. But when researchers actually calculated their real net worth, over $1 million, decades ahead of what their income alone would ever have predicted. So, naturally, they asked how, and the answer was almost frustrating in how simple it was. They built a budget in their 20s, and just, quietly, never stopped following. They bought a modest home early on, and instead of trading up every time a friend or coworker moved somewhere bigger, somewhere shinier, they stayed exactly where they were. They invested every single month without exception, whether the market was climbing or collapsing, whether life felt stable or completely chaotic. They treated saving like a bill that absolutely had to be paid first, never a leftover that might happen if there was anything spare at the end of the month. Now, let's flip to the opposite end of the spectrum, because this story reframes everything, and it might make you a little uneasy about someone you know. There's a man in the study, referred to only by his profession, an attorney earning a salary that put him comfortably in the top slice of American income earners. On the surface, he had everything anyone would ever want: the corner office overlooking the city, the country club membership his father-in-law had helped arrange, a car that cost more than what many families managed to save across their entire lives. But when researchers actually ran the numbers on his real net worth, barely above zero, a man earning 6 figures a year for well over a decade, and by every measure that actually matters in the long run, essentially broke. Income is not wealth. It never has been. Income is only the raw material, the clay you're handed, and what you actually do with it is the entire sculpture. This is exactly why so many high earners, doctors, attorneys, executives spend their entire lives feeling successful without ever quite becoming wealthy. They're taught, subtly, constantly, from every direction, that a high income means they've already arrived, so they start spending as though they've already arrived. And that exact spending becomes the very thing that guarantees they never actually do. Here's a twist buried inside the data that genuinely surprised even the researchers, something worth sitting with if you've ever compared your own life to someone else's Instagram feed. People living in more expensive homes were, on average, worse at building actual wealth than people living in more modest homes, even when their incomes were completely identical. How is that even possible? Because an expensive home doesn't just cost a bigger mortgage payment. It costs an entire lifestyle built to match it. Furniture that fits the scale of the house. A neighborhood full of pricier restaurants just down the street. Neighbors whose spending habits slowly, quietly become your spending habits, without you ever consciously agreeing to any of it. One big decision ends up triggering a dozen smaller ones, spreading outward silently for years, completely unnoticed, until you finally add it all up. So here's a question worth sitting with, honestly, with nobody watching and absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. If you ran that formula on yourself right now, age times income divided by 10, are you above that number or below it? Don't panic if the answer stings a little. Almost everyone underestimates exactly how much their lifestyle has quietly been working against them in ways they never noticed until this exact moment. Because here's the encouraging part, hiding underneath all of this discomfort. What researchers found next wasn't about talent or luck or some inheritance you either happened to receive or didn't. It was about a set of specific, learnable behaviors, patterns that repeated themselves over and over across wildly different people, wildly different professions, wildly different starting points in life. Let's walk through them properly, one at a time, because each one deserves its own moment. The first pattern is that these households consistently live well below what they actually earn, no matter how large that number eventually grows. Most people fall into something researchers call the lifestyle trap, where every raise, every bonus, every unexpected windfall gets absorbed almost instantly into a slightly nicer version of the exact same life. A slightly bigger house, a slightly newer car, a slightly fancier vacation, every single year, indefinitely. The households in this study broke that pattern deliberately, on purpose, over and over again. When their income rose, their actual spending largely stayed exactly where it already was, and the gap between what came in and what went out widened year after year, and that widening gap is the entire quiet engine behind real wealth. The second pattern involves how deliberately these people used their time, their energy, and their money, almost as though their own life were a company with a specific mission, where every hour and every dollar either moved them forward or quietly drained away. There's a woman in the study who spent, by her own estimate, several hours every single month simply reviewing her investments, researching major purchases before making them, thinking through decisions most people make on impulse in about 4 seconds, not because she found spreadsheets thrilling, because she understood that time spent planning money was one of the highest returns available to her. Full stop. The third pattern is something almost emotional in nature, a belief that financial independence mattered more than looking successful in front of people who, honestly, barely thought about her at all. There's a woman in the research who made a conscious decision, decades earlier, to simply stop caring what her neighbors thought about her car. The moment she let go of that particular competition, her savings rate tripled almost overnight, because so much of her previous spending had never really been about her own happiness in the first place. It had been a performance, staged for an audience that, if she was honest with herself, was barely even watching. Now, here's where the story slows down, because the fourth pattern deserves far more room than a quick mention, and honestly, it might be the single most important idea in this entire video. It's called economic outpatient care, and once you understand what it actually means, you will never look at generous parents the same way again. There's a story from the research about a man who built a manufacturing business from absolutely nothing, growing up with very little himself, working relentlessly for decades, so his son would never have to struggle the way he once had. So, he gave him a down payment on a house. He handed him a brand new car the week he graduated college. He quietly covered a business loss when his son's first venture started falling apart in year 2. He paid for private school tuition for his grandchildren without a second thought, year after year. Every single one of these gifts, taken completely on its own, looked exactly like love. And in a very real sense, it was. But here's the twist that genuinely unsettled even experienced financial researchers when the data finally came in. Adult children who received substantial financial help from their parents ended up, on average, with lower net worth than children who received little to no financial help at all, even when both groups earned remarkably similar incomes. Read that again, slowly, because it flips everything we assume generosity is supposed to do. More money handed down from parents didn't lead to more wealth in the next generation. It led to less. How does something so kind produce a result this backwards? Because the gifts, quietly, without anyone ever saying it directly, sent a signal that struggle was optional, that if the numbers didn't add up on their own, someone would always be there to step in, that the safety net wasn't a last resort reserved for genuine emergencies. It was simply the default response, every single time, to almost every kind of financial discomfort. And once that belief settles into someone's mind, even quietly, even completely unconsciously, it reshapes every financial decision they make going forward, for years, sometimes for the rest of their lives. They take on slightly more risk than they probably should, because failure never quite feels permanent. They save a little less than they could, because urgency never fully arrives at their doorstep. They negotiate less aggressively for their own salary, because the stakes never feel as sharp as they should, not when there's always a cushion waiting somewhere behind them. There's a couple in the research who handled this completely differently, quietly, almost invisibly, and their story genuinely deserves a moment. Their daughter graduated college and struggled through 2 genuinely rough years in a low-paying first job, the kind of job that barely covers rent in a decent city. They watched her eat the same cheap meals week after week. They watched her cram into a small apartment with 3 roommates in a neighborhood she never actually wanted to live in. And even though it was hard, even though a single phone call could have fixed nearly all of it instantly, they never once mentioned how easily they could have made the entire situation disappear. By the time she turned 30, she had built a 6-figure consulting business of her own, entirely from scratch, and she credits those 2 uncomfortable years, not despite the discomfort, but specifically because of it, as the exact period where she learned to actually solve problems instead of quietly escaping them. Here's a question I want you to actually sit with, and this time, it isn't about your children, if you even have any. It's about you. Has someone in your life been quietly cushioning a habit that should have forced you to change a long time ago? A parent covering a bill you should honestly be covering yourself by now. A partner absorbing your overspending without ever once bringing it up directly. Even a credit limit that keeps letting you avoid a decision your own bank account has been trying to force on you for months, maybe years. Because underneath everything we've just walked through, the real lesson was never only about parents and children. It's about the difference between comfort and growth, and how often, without even fully noticing it happening, people choose the option that feels better right now, at the direct expense of the one that would actually set them free years down the road. Let's shift gears now, because there's a related idea buried in this research that almost nobody talks about, one that quietly determines whether all of these good financial habits ever get the chance to work in the first place. It has to do with marriage, and it might be the most overlooked variable in the entire book. Researchers found something almost startling when they compared households where both partners agreed on financial goals against households where one partner was disciplined and the other wasn't. The disagreement itself, not the actual spending, turned out to be one of the strongest predictors of whether a family would ever accumulate real wealth at all. There's a couple in the study, and honestly, their early story sounds almost painfully familiar. He wanted to save aggressively, invest consistently, live well below their means. She wanted a nicer home, sooner rather than later, nicer vacations, the visible markers of a life that felt, to her, like it was actually going somewhere. For years, this disagreement created constant, quiet friction, the kind that never explodes into anything dramatic, but slowly drains a marriage of trust. Anyway, neither of them was wrong, exactly. They simply hadn't had the conversation that actually mattered, the one about what money was supposed to be for in the first place. Eventually, and this took years longer than either of them would have liked, they sat down and built something researchers found again and again in genuinely wealthy households: a shared, explicit agreement about exactly how much they'd spend, exactly how much they'd save, and exactly what both of those numbers were actually in service of, not a rigid, joyless budget neither of them could stand. An actual conversation about values, translated into numbers they both genuinely believed in. Within a decade, their household had moved from barely scraping by on a strong income to sitting comfortably in the prodigious accumulator category, and both of them, when interviewed separately, pointed to that single conversation as the actual turning point, far more than any raise, any investment, return, or any lucky break. This is worth remembering because it's easy to think of wealth building as an entirely individual pursuit, something you do alone with a spreadsheet and enough willpower. But for households with two people in them, the real unlock is almost always agreement, not intensity. Two people rowing in the same direction will always outperform, one person rowing brilliantly, while the other quietly rows the opposite way. Now, let's talk about something Stanley found almost by accident, buried inside the career data, and it might be the single most surprising discovery in the entire study. Here's a question that sounds simple, but almost nobody actually asks it out loud. If you wanted to become wealthy, does it matter less what you do for a living, and more where exactly you choose to do it? When researchers broke down the millionaires in their study by profession, the list wasn't dominated by doctors and attorneys. The professions our entire culture has been trained to associate with real financial success. It was dominated by business owners, and specifically, unglamorous business owners. Pest control companies, even contractors, scrap metal dealers, welding equipment, suppliers, owners of small chains of laundromats, businesses that are, by almost any measure, unglamorous, sometimes literally dirty, and yet consistently, quietly profitable, with almost no competition, because very few people ever wanted to do them in the first place. There's a man in the study who owned a small regional chain of coin-operated laundromats, about as unglamorous a business as you could possibly imagine. But he understood something. Most career-driven professionals never stop long enough to calculate properly. He wasn't trading his hours directly for dollars the way an employee does. He owned an asset that produced income whether he was physically standing in the room or not. His machines ran at 2 in the morning while he was fast asleep. They ran on holidays, while everyone else in his life was completely off the clock. They earned money during the exact hours a doctor or an attorney would be totally unable to earn a single additional dollar, no matter how skilled or dedicated they were, simply because their income was permanently capped by the literal number of hours in a single day. Stanley called this idea choosing the right pond, and it might be the single most underrated piece of advice buried anywhere in this entire book. His argument was refreshingly simple. Your income potential isn't only about how talented you happen to be, it's about how much competition exists in the exact space you've chosen to compete in. A brilliant attorney, surrounded by 10,000 other equally brilliant attorneys, is competing in an ocean, fighting constantly just to stay visible. A competent paving contractor in a mid-sized town, with maybe 2 other competitors in the entire region, is swimming in a small, quiet, profitable pond, with enormous room to dominate and almost nobody actively fighting him for it. There's another story, one that always gets a reaction, about a woman who owned a small business selling farm equipment parts, a category so specific and so unglamorous that most people would never even think to consider it a business at all. But because almost nobody else wanted to compete in that particular space, she faced essentially no competition for decades, built enormous customer loyalty simply by being reliable and answering her phone promptly, and quietly became one of the wealthiest people in her entire county, all while most of her neighbors assumed she ran a modest little parts shop that probably just barely got by. Here's the twist that makes this idea so much bigger than laundromats and farm parts. Wealth builds fastest, not necessarily through the highest possible income, but through ownership of a business, of an asset, of something that keeps producing value, whether you're actively working in that exact moment or not, because ownership scales in a way that hourly and salaried labor simply cannot. An employee's income is capped by hours. An owner's income is capped only by the size of the pond they've chosen and how well they serve it. Let's pause here for a second, because I want you to actually picture something. Picture 2 people who graduated from the exact same college in the exact same year with remarkably similar grades. One of them goes into a highly competitive, prestigious field, surrounded by thousands of equally qualified peers, all chasing the same handful of impressive job titles. The other goes into something nobody at their graduation ceremony would have called impressive, something a little dirty, a little unglamorous, something most of their classmates wouldn't have even considered. 20 years later, According to everything this research uncovered, there's a very real chance, not because they worked harder, not because they were smarter, because they chose a smaller pond with far less competition, and they built genuine ownership inside it, while their classmate was still competing furiously in an ocean, one promotion at a time, one bonus at a time, permanently capped by the hours in a single day. Now, let's bring all of this into the world you're actually living in right now, because the truth is, this research is decades old, and the pressures working against you today are, in some very real ways, even sharper than the ones these researchers originally studied. When Stanley first conducted this research, the pressure to look wealthy came almost entirely from your literal physical neighborhood. The houses you drove past every single day, the country club you weren't quite a member of, the neighbor's new car sitting in the driveway right next door. That pressure was absolutely real, but it had a natural limit, because you could only ever compare yourself to the small handful of people you could actually see with your own eyes. That limit is completely gone now. You're no longer comparing yourself to a few dozen neighbors. You're comparing yourself to an endless, perfectly curated highlight reel of thousands of strangers, each one showing you their single best financial moment, filtered, staged, and in plenty of cases, not even genuinely real, purchased specifically on credit to be photographed exactly once and quietly forgotten about immediately afterward. This creates something researchers back then could never have fully anticipated, a kind of constant, low-grade financial anxiety that follows people around all day, every day, triggered dozens of times without them even fully realizing it's happening. The businesses this research called unsexy still exist today, and honestly, they're arguably even more valuable now than they were decades ago, because an entire generation has been culturally pushed towards saturated, highly visible fields: content creation, influencer marketing, competitive tech roles. Everyone seems to want, leaving the unglamorous, high-demand trades even less crowded than they used to be. Economic outpatient care has a modern cousin worth naming directly, something we might call digital outpatient care. A parent covering a phone bill indefinitely, a streaming subscription quietly paid for years past when it should have stopped, a car payment for an adult child who is fully capable of covering it themselves. Small, seemingly harmless subsidies that, exactly like the original research showed decades ago, quietly remove the exact friction that would otherwise force real financial growth to happen. And the formula, age multiplied by income divided by 10, still works exactly the same way it did back then, because it was never really about the specific dollar amounts involved. It was always about the relationship between what flows in and what actually manages to stay. Here's the modern application, worth actually acting on this week. Something concrete, something you can genuinely do in the next 24 hours if you're willing. List out every single recurring or installment obligation currently sitting in your financial life, not just credit cards and loans, but every buy now, pay later plan, every subscription quietly tied to some kind of financing, every 0% promotional balance sitting patiently in the background of your monthly spending. Most people, when they actually sit down and do this properly, discover they have significantly more open obligations than they initially assumed, precisely because modern debt has been carefully engineered to feel invisible, spread across small, low-friction payments, instead of one large, alarming number staring back at you from a single statement. Once you have that complete list in front of you, ask yourself the exact same question. that quietly built every fortune in this entire study. Does each item on this list genuinely make your life better? Or does it exist primarily to be seen by someone else? That single, slightly uncomfortable question, asked consistently over years, is the entire method behind every millionaire in this research, distilled down into one simple, repeatable habit. They never got lucky. They simply asked that question more often than everyone around them, quietly, for decades, without ever needing anyone else to notice or applaud them for it. Let's return, for a moment, to some of the individual stories buried in this research, because there are a few that deserve extra attention before we bring everything together. There's a school teacher in the study, a woman who spent 31 years in the same elementary classroom, teaching third graders how to read, never earning anywhere close to a six-figure salary in her entire career. By the time she retired, her net worth had quietly crossed $2 million. When researchers asked how, expecting some clever investment strategy or a hidden inheritance, her answer was almost disarmingly simple. She started contributing to her retirement account the very first year she started teaching, and she simply never stopped, never paused, never borrowed against it, not even during genuinely difficult years when it would have been completely understandable to do so. She drove the same reliable sedan for nearly 15 years at a time. She packed her own lunch every single school day for 3 decades, not because she couldn't afford to buy something, but because, in her own words, she'd simply never seen the appeal of paying $5 for a sandwich she could make at home in 90 seconds. There's another story, this one involving a couple who ran a small independent hardware store in a town most people outside the region have never heard of. For 38 years, they opened that store 6 days a week, closed on Sundays, and lived in the same house they bought in their late 20s. They never took out a car loan in their entire married life, always saving cash and buying used vehicles outright, then driving them until they genuinely fell apart. When the husband passed away and his wife finally sat down with an accountant to settle the estate, the accountant found himself double-checking the numbers, certain he'd made some kind of error. He hadn't. The hardware store and the modest, unassuming life built quietly around it had produced a net worth well past $3 million, a fact that genuinely stunned nearly everyone in their small town. People who had shopped at that store for decades without ever once suspecting anything unusual about the couple who ran it. These stories matter, not because they're unusual, but because, according to this research, they're actually far more representative of real American wealth than the images our culture constantly pushes in front of us. The teacher, the hardware store owners, the man with the laundromats, the farmer walking into that bank lobby in muddy work boots. These are the actual faces of wealth in this country, far more often than the yacht, the mansion, or the sports car we've all been conditioned to associate with the word. So here's the major reveal, the one this entire research was really building toward all along, even if it took years of surveys and thousands of interviews to fully prove it. Wealth was never about how much money passes through your hands. It was always about how much of it you actually manage to keep, and, more importantly, why you choose to keep it in the first place. The people who understood this most clearly weren't chasing appearances. They were chasing something quieter, something that doesn't photograph well, something that never shows up in a highlight reel. They were chasing the ability to make choices, real choices, about their own time, their own family, their own future, entirely on their own terms, without needing anyone else's permission or approval. That's what all of this was actually for, the whole time. Not the number itself, what the number quietly buys you, which is freedom, real freedom. The kind that doesn't need to be photographed to be genuinely felt. Let's go back, one final time, to that man in the bank lobby, the farmer in muddy boots, holding a check for $240,000, while a loan officer scrambled to recalibrate everything she thought she understood about who he was. He wasn't smarter than the people who dismissed him at first glance. He wasn't luckier than his neighbors. He simply made one decision, over and over, for decades, to value what he was actually building over what he appeared to be building. And that single, repeated decision quietly compounded into a life that most people spend their entire careers chasing and never quite manage to reach. He was never hiding some secret formula the rest of us couldn't access. He was simply willing to look, on the outside, completely unremarkable, while the only number that ever truly mattered kept growing steadily behind the scenes, invisible to everyone except the people who actually bothered to check. And now that you understand the real difference between looking wealthy and genuinely being wealthy, you're not going to be able to unknow it. The next time you see a new car in a parking lot, a designer bag on someone's shoulder, a picture from some perfectly staged resort vacation, some small part of your mind is quietly going to ask the question underneath the question. Is this real, or is this simply the appearance of it? If this kind of story is the kind of thing you want more of, there's a simple, easy way to make sure you never miss the next one. And honestly, that's really the only thing I'll ever ask of you. Because somewhere out there right now, in a town you've probably never heard of, there's another version of that farmer, another version of that school teacher, another version of that couple running a hardware store 6 days a week, completely invisible to a culture that has spent decades looking in exactly the wrong direction. The only real question left, the one worth sitting with long after this video ends, is whether you're willing to become just as invisible for just as long to end up exactly where they already are.